Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. So this is actually our third webinar in this series of webinars. Today's webinar is all about our photo tours and photography expedition micro cruises. And for those of you who did miss our first two webinars, they were on Svalbard and East Greenland as destinations as a whole. So for more of a deeper dive, do go back there on our website and you can watch them. But before we jump into today's webinar, just a little bit of housekeeping. So everyone who has joined, your cameras and your microphones have all been switched off, so nobody can see or hear you, but hopefully you can all see and hear me. And if you do have any questions as we go, do pop them in the Q&A function, which is down in the bottom of your screen. And we've got our wonderful colleague Margarita on the Q&A, and we will come back to questions in more depth at the end of the presentation. But I'm very excited to announce that for this photo webinar, we have one of our photo leaders, our expedition leaders and guide, Giancarlo. So Giancarlo, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, as Luis briefly said, my name is Giancarlo Gallinoro and I work with Circuit Atlas as an expedition guide or leader depending on the trips, and I'm a photographer, mostly a wildlife photographer with a background in wildlife conservation, biology and conservation. And I spend about half of the year in Svalbard every year, and then a smaller period in Greenland. And in Svalbard, I also work as a mountain guide, kayak guide. We also do winter camps, multi-day camps. So, the whole package. Yeah, that is a little bit about me.
Perfect. Thank you, Giancarlo. So we'll come back to Giancarlo in a little while, and he'll share a lot more and sort of his top tips and go over our photography trips in a little more detail. Today, I wanted to start off really with why choose a micro expedition cruise. And this is really important, especially on our photography trips. It's important on all of our trips, and we think it's the best way to explore the Arctic regions. Why choose a micro expedition? We have two ships at Secret Atlas, both of which are only 12 passenger ships. So it's a real intimate onboard experience. We only have 6 guests in each Zodiac. So it's especially good for our photography trips. So you've got lots of room in that Zodiac for extra camera lenses, extra camera bodies, and we have a really good guide ratio. So actually on our photography trips, so we have 2 expedition guides who will be the ones running their excursions, but we also have the added benefit of having a third photo guide on board. Giancarlo will cover what that means and what that looks like, but it's a very good guide ratio, and you'll get lots of one-on-one time with the guides as well. So the guides, they'll have breakfast, they'll have lunch, they'll have dinner with you, they'll probably even have maybe an evening glass of wine with you after dinner. So you'll get to know them. You've got lots of one-on-one time for any questions you may have. But it's well, being just 12 people, the ship, we have an open door policy in our bridge lounge. You can head up to the bridge and interact with the captain, and that's where the guides are often looking and scouting for wildlife, so it's a real good place to hang out. But also on the ship, it is an open ship, so you're allowed out on the deck at any time, and there's lots of room for photography. But we will come to the ships in a bit more detail later in the presentation. For me, the real essence of why choose a micro expedition, it's the time, really. So I was actually with Giancarlo earlier in April on one of the photo trips, and just realizing the time you get on a micro expedition. So there was, I think it was our first day, it was our first excursion. We actually went out in the Zodiacs. We came into a fjord and we saw a few black dots dotted around, and we got in the Zodiacs, and then Giancarlo drove over, and we had a walrus. And this was the first wildlife sighting we had on the trip. It was the first day, it was the first excursion. Everyone was excited, and it was a photography trip. And I think we must have spent maybe 2 hours with that one walrus. So it's just that flexibility in our schedules that we have. It's really that time you get out on excursions and with the guides, which makes it so special. But just to talk about our destinations, as I mentioned, we have run sort of separate webinars on East Greenland and Svalbard as a whole, but I wanted to touch on our photo tours and when they run. So essentially we run our photo tours early season in the spring in Svalbard, but we also run them in late season. And the reason for doing this, so in Svalbard, we run our photo tours in April, May and early June. And this is because we have the best light. We have the best light for photography at that time of year. So, but typically our photo tours, they could be 8-10 days. Our Svalbard ones in early sort of April, May, we'll typically come out of Longyearbyen and head up and explore the northwest coast. But it's very flexible, it's very dynamic. If the weather's looking bad up that way, we might head south. And if the conditions allow, we might head up to the ice pack. And same for, so our Greenland tours, we actually run them very late in the season. So we run these the last week of September and October. And we actually call these our East Greenland Northern Lights tours, because that time of the year, we've got really good hours of darkness. So we've got really good opportunity to see the Northern Lights. But it's not just the Northern Lights that you'll see in Greenland, but that trip is focused on Scoresby Sund and that area. But as I say, if you need more information and want to find out more, do rewatch our previous webinars. But before I hand over to Giancarlo, I just wanted to give you a little taste of both of those destinations and what you might expect to see on one of our photo tours. For Svalbard, as I mentioned, this is going to be April, May, early June. There's lots of sea ice still around, so you're going to get really beautiful Arctic landscapes, lots of snow, lots of sea ice to play with. But Svalbard, as you can see, our photo trips, they are quite heavily focused on the wildlife. So in terms of wildlife that we may see, so that time of year, we've got the reindeer, we've got Arctic fox. We might actually get the Arctic fox in its pure white winter coat if you're going in April and early May, and then it changes to its summer coat. But yeah, we've got good opportunities to see walruses. The birds are starting to arrive, but even in the early season, it's really good for sort of your ducks, your geese, your eiders. And then the main one, which everyone wants to see, is the polar bear. So again, that early season is a really good time to spot polar bears because they're out, they're hunting on the sea ice. And it also marks the start of the whales do start to arrive in May as well. So we've got good chances, but the guides are always looking out for the wildlife. And if we see wildlife, you can guarantee we'll be getting out on those Zodiacs and exploring. And as I said, so East Greenland, so we run this very late in the season, and it is essentially the return of winter to the Arctic. So it's a real beautiful time to visit Greenland. It's the return of the sea ice. We start to get a bit more snow return. So it's a real beautiful time, but the Greenland trip is very focused on the landscapes, especially the icebergs. The icebergs over in East Greenland are some of the biggest icebergs you will see, but it's a very cultural destination. This is the town in picture here. This is a town of Itokotomit, and we visit this town on all of our East Greenland trips, and it's a real good photography experience. As you can see, it's a very picturesque town, and the locals are really friendly in this town. Obviously, we do need to we interact with them, and we need that permission before we take any pictures. But it's a real gem of a destination. And again, wildlife in East Greenland. So the big draw card, and we do see this. We have a very high success rate. Is the musk ox, but we do get other wildlife in East Greenland. It's just not as common as Svalbard, so we're always careful, but we still have got chances of seeing polar bears. We've still got chances of seeing whale species and seals, but yeah, we really focus on the landscape. And as mentioned, Northern Lights, so we will be running sort of evening workshops on board, which Giancarlo will touch on shortly, but we'll be always looking out for Northern Lights. And if you do go to bed early, we do run a little system on board, so you have to just declare that you're happy, and Giancarlo or one of the guides will come knocking on your door. So if they do make an appearance, we will wake you up in the middle of the night if you're happy to do so. And lastly, I just wanted to touch on the onboard experience. So once you step on board a trip with Secret Atlas, everything is included. So we don't charge for any extras. All of your excursions are included, but we run a series of lectures on board as well. So especially for the photography trips, a lot of those lectures will be based around photography, how to use your cameras, but they're also we run them on wildlife, local history, and special interest subjects as well. So that's something to look out for. But in terms of excursions, as I say, they're all included. It's a mixture of what we call Zodiac cruising, so out in the Zodiacs, looking for the wildlife, looking at the scenery, getting a bit closer to the glaciers or the icebergs. But we also do some hiking, and the hiking excursions can look very different, dependent on the season. Typically in the early season, so when we're running the photo tours, the hiking excursions are quite short, because there's lots of ice, there's lots of snow around, but we still like to get off the ship and do short hiking. But there is an option to do slightly longer hiking, but that really opens up more in this. But yeah, on board you've got everything's included from your food and drinks. Breakfast, lunch tends to be buffet style, whereas dinner's more of a formal sit-down meal, and all of your drinks are included as well. But particularly important for these early and late season trips, the temperatures can be quite cold at that time of year, so we do include your all-in-one suits, and we include the muck boots as well. And those muck boots are for you to wear whenever you're out on an excursion, because often when you're stepping out of the Zodiac, you will be stepping maybe into the sea or onto the ice, so they're there to keep you warm and protected from the elements. But that is a real quick snapshot of our destinations and what to expect. But yeah, I want to hand over to Giancarlo to talk more about the photography.
All right. Thanks, Luis. So the main question that I usually get before these expeditions are, what gear should I bring? Because clearly the setting might be a little bit different to what most people are used to, and also the way we explore might be a little bit different. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the gear. Clearly, this is my suggestion. It's not like mandatory or anything. You're still free to bring whatever kit you want. But over the years, I've gained some experience about what's practical, basically. First thing first, I usually suggest bringing 2 camera bodies. And this is for a few different reasons. I will talk about 3 because I think they're the 3 main ones. The first one is you really want to have a backup when you're out there, because if anything happens to your main camera, then you're stuck on a ship for over a week without a means to take photos. So that's reason number 1, and it's a really good reason, I think. Reason number 2 is we are out in the elements, so it's going to be cold depending on the season. It might be snowy, rainy. There might be water splashes when we're on the Zodiac, even if we always try to avoid that. So my point is you really want to try and expose the sensor of your camera as little as possible. So if you need to switch lenses all the time, you end up getting salt water in your camera. You really don't want that. So what I do personally is I have one body with a long lens for wildlife and one body with a wide lens for landscape. So I'm always ready to shoot. And that is the third point. You might be taking a landscape photo and all of a sudden a seal appears in the water 20 meters away. You really don't have time to switch and put on your long lens. So 2 camera bodies. Clearly, if you don't have a second one, you don't have a second one. But I would highly recommend bringing 2. And then the next point would be lenses. And as I always say, bring a wide lens, a long lens, and everything in between. Now with this, I don't mean bring 15 different lenses, but as long as you can cover more or less all the focal length range, then you're good. So for example, what I bring personally on these expeditions is a 200 to 600 for wildlife, and then I have a 24 to 105 for landscape. And then if it's a Northern Light trip, then I'll talk about it a little bit later. But yeah, so no need to bring many different lenses. Just make sure you have enough, and then you can leave them on the ship, and on a daily basis you can decide which one to bring out with you on the expedition, on the excursions. And then bring plenty of batteries, because as you might know, cold temperature and batteries, they're not a good match. The batteries don't last as long, so bring spare batteries. And when you go out, especially on the Zodiac, but also hiking, put the batteries in the inside pocket of your jacket or of the overall that we're going to give you, so you keep them nice and warm. And plenty of memory cards, SD cards, CF, depending on what you use. Very important. I noticed that quite often guests don't bring a laptop and external hard drives. Those are essential because you always want to back up the photos that you've taken during the day. And also, as Luis mentioned, we're going to be running workshops and editing sessions. So you really want to have a laptop or something to edit on. And then, there's other bits of gear like filters. That's entirely up to you. I think it's not very practical because Remember, we are in a cold environment, so you're going to be wearing gloves and, having to adjust small filters, screw on small filters on the lens. It's not very practical in the cold. So just keep that in mind. A tripod is essential if we are doing a Northern Lights trip, but otherwise, I don't recommend it because, the ship, if we are on the ship, then the ship tends to move. If we are on the Zodiac, same thing. And if we are hiking, then it's extra weight that you're carrying. So for most trips, I don't recommend bringing a tripod. If it's a Northern Light trip, then I'll talk about it a little bit later. And last but not least, a waterproof backpack for your camera gear. Because we do spend quite a lot of time in the Zodiacs, and so you want to have something to protect your gear. What about drones? Because that's a question that we get all the time. Because Secret Atlas is part of IACO, which is the organization that manages tourism in the Arctic, and IACO said no to drones. So unfortunately, we can't let you fly your drone, both Svalbard and Greenland. So drones, unfortunately, are a no-go. Yeah, and as I was saying just a minute ago, we will spend a lot of time on the Zodiac. So I just want to talk a little bit very briefly about different scenarios that we will be shooting in. One first scenario is from the ship. This is Vikingfjord. It has a nice bow where we can take photos from, which is a little bit high. So in certain cases, we can actually move to the side of the ship, which is very low. So you're almost down to the water. So there's endless possibilities to shoot from the ship. And actually, this photo was taken from the platform that's just above the bridge. So you can also go up there to take this beautiful open landscape shots like this one. So that's the first scenario, but clearly on the ship, you can go in and out, so you don't need to worry too much about what to bring with you. You can always run inside, grab the other lens and switch it and go back out. However, it is very different when we are actually on a Zodiac, which is, again, like probably I would say our favorite way of exploring, because it allows us to roam the shore, go in the brush ice, get closer to wildlife, explore areas that we wouldn't be able to explore with the ship. And also clearly we use them to go ashore. When we are on the Zodiac, there are a few things that we need to keep in mind, especially with photography equipment. The first thing is, whenever you're getting in the Zodiac or out of the Zodiac, we want you guys to have both your hands free, okay? Which means no cameras in your hand, nothing strapped on you like that. So the way it works is you get in the Zodiac and then a member of the crew is going to pass us your backpack and then we'll hand it to you. And on the way out from the Zodiac, it's the same thing. You go out first with both hands free, and then we'll hand you your backpack, which is why I was saying just before that it's really important to have a nice waterproof backpack. And the backpack needs to be waterproof because clearly we are very close to the water. And, if there's a few splashes here and there in the Zodiac, the floor of the Zodiac might be a little bit wet. So it's nice to have a waterproof backpack. In terms of how much gear we pack when we go out, one backpack per person, that's ideal. So I think it's pointless to bring 6 different lenses when you're on the Zodiac, because first, there isn't like infinite room to, place your gear. So if you come down with a huge duffel bag full of gear, then it gets a little bit uncomfortable. And then again, you really don't want to have to fiddle too much with too much equipment. So one backpack per person, that's usually great. And then the last thing is, when we are in the Zodiac, as Lewis mentioned, it's usually 6 guests per Zodiac plus the guide, which means that normally we have 3 people sitting on the right side of the Zodiac and 3 people on the left. And when we approach wildlife or any points of interest, we normally place the Zodiac sideways. And so my last point, which is be nice, what I mean by that is always be mindful of the people around you on the Zodiac. So again, normally if we place the Zodiac like that, the 3 people sitting on this side, they can kneel down like the guy in the picture here on the front and put your elbows on the pontoon. And then you have a nice stable position to take photos. And you're also quite low on the water, which is nice for wildlife. And then the people on the other side, they still have a nice clear line of sight without heads popping up. Because What sometimes happens is that maybe someone is moving around a lot, the people behind are getting a little bit frustrated, but they don't say anything, and that can kind of ruin the mood of the group. So yeah, just always be mindful of other people around you, and then we'll make sure that you always have the perfect angle to take the right photo at the right time. So that's about the Zodiacs. And again, both in Svalbard and in Greenland, we're going to be using the Zodiacs a lot. So always be aware of, equipment, gear, gloves, and all that. But then if we're talking about Greenland, and as Lewis said, it's mainly focused on Northern Lights, then there's a little bit different conditions, because clearly Northern Lights happen at night. And at nighttime, we don't usually go out on Zodiacs because, there might be polar bears and we don't see them come. We might get stuck in the ice and things like that. So normally when we shoot Northern Lights, we do it from the ship. Now you might be thinking, but the ship moves. Yeah, that is true. However, the way we deal with this is we either get very deep into the fjords, and when you do that, then the water is usually very still, almost like a lake. And when you have huge chunks of ice in the water, which is the case of Greenland, the ice is also dampening down the waves. So normally it's really, really stable. Or the other thing we do is we find some sea ice and we actually park in the sea ice with the ship, so that the ice is actually keeping the ship nice and stable. Now, that being said, we're still at sea, so we need to keep a couple of things into consideration. The first one, you really need a good tripod. So don't bring one of those very thin travel tripods that are like very shaky. Bring a nice solid one. And that's the first bit of gear that's really important. And the second one is the choice of lens. For Northern Lights, you really need a wide lens. We're talking 14 to 20 millimeters, something like that, because Northern Lights are huge. And if you also want to include some landscape in the photo, then you really need a wide lens. But even more important than that is you want to have a very bright lens, meaning with wide aperture, as wide as possible. I would say f2.0 or less. 1.4 would be ideal. And the reason for that is that being on a ship that could move slightly, as stable as we try to keep it, then we can't use really long exposure. So we need to keep the exposure down to maybe 4-6 seconds, which means that you need a lot of light to get into the camera, to the sensor. And for that reason, you really need a really bright lens. So that's really important. So this is very briefly about Northern Lights. Then clearly there's a lot more that we could talk about. And the last point is that, as Luis mentioned, on photo trips, there's always a photo leader. So let me give you an example. Next year in May, I'm leading a trip in Svalbard. So it's going to be me as an expedition leader. And I'm also a photographer, so I can also help you with that. But then we have a dedicated photo leader. In this case, it's called Lana Tanir, a National Geographic Explorer. And the way we deal with this is on the ship, we're going to run a lot of lectures and education. And that could be, generally speaking, about photography, so composition, equipment, settings, and things like that. Then we usually run some editing sessions, and that could be group sessions, but we also run one-to-one sessions. So if there's a photo you really like and you would like to develop, but you don't know what direction to take, we will look into that. But any other questions about photography, we're always available to help you with that. And then when we go out in the field, there's always going to be usually me on one Zodiac, and just to give you an example, a specific example, and Lana, the photo leader, on the other Zodiac, which means that in each Zodiac, you have a photographer that can help you. So for example, if you're not sure about settings, you can ask. If you're not sure, your camera gets stuck, you can ask any help with that. And we're always, again, going to make sure that we are angled in the right point, in the right direction for the light and for the best view. And that's the same ashore. So it's really important that you always listen to what the guides tell you, not necessarily when it comes to photography, but for example, when we are approaching wildlife or certain specific scenarios, always make sure to listen to your guide, because we might have some tips And if you're far away, you're gonna miss those, and you might miss a nice shot. But yeah, this is very quickly from the photography point of view of our expeditions. So I will give the word back to Luis. Thank you.
Thank you, Giancarlo. That was super useful. And yeah, you've already got me thinking about buying a new lens. What vessels are we using for these trips? So I just wanted to touch on that very briefly. So we have two vessels which we run our photo top tours from. So we have the MV Freya. The MV Freya, she's a really beautiful traditional ship. She's very comfortable on board. We've got really nice lounge areas, really nice dining areas. But one of the best things about the Freya is she's got a 1A ice class rating, and that just means she's got a super strong hull. So like as Giancarlo said, when we are, especially for some of the Northern Lights tours, like if we are parking her in the sea ice, if we're letting it sort of freeze in, like she can handle that. There's no problem at all. So she's a really strong ship. But yeah, on the inside, as you can see, she's a really comfortable expedition vessel. There's 7 guest cabins. The guest cabins are comprised of 1 fixed double, 4 twin cabins, and then we've got 2 single cabins as well for solo travelers. And just to touch on our second ship, so the MV Vikingfjord. So again, a very, very strong ship. So she's a 1B ice class, like she's capable as well. She can handle anything thrown at her, but she's a very, very modern ship on the interior. You can see she's got that real nice Scandinavian, really lots of natural light in. But you've probably seen from both the ships, there's a lot of outside deck space. So we've got the bow of the ship on the Vikingfjord, but also down here along the side of the ship, there's really good opportunities for photography. And then we've got a rear balcony here. But it's also the same on the Freya. There's really nice, like this outside deck space on the rear balcony. We've got all of this. This is really low to the ground. So if we do see a wildlife whilst the ship's in transit, or even if it's at anchor, like you've got really nice positions to get low. But again, you can use, the ship is an open ship, you can use the bow of the ship as well. And the cabins on the Vikingfjord, so we've got 1 fixed double cabin, we've got 4 cabins which can either be twins or doubles, and then we also have 2 solo single cabins as well. And yeah, this is, as I was talking about earlier, the bridge area, which is a really nice place to relax, grab a morning coffee. You often find the guides up here scouting for wildlife. But I did want to quickly touch on sort of sustainability in action. So at Secret Atlas, we do like to do a lot, especially when we're on the trips as well. And as we've mentioned, we are part of IACO. So yeah, we do follow the IACO rules and regulations. But when we're out in the field, we do like to do, like both the Zodiacs have got trash bags, litter pickers. So if we are out and we see any rubbish, any plastics, any fishing nets, we like to pick that up, bring that back and dispose of it properly. We always like to leave the environments better than what we found them. And there are certain trips that we run which we invite scientists on board for sort of research. So this company is called Yachts for Science. They were on board the Freya twice last year, and they're doing really crucial work in sort of mapping the seabed. So they're sending RVs down and seeing what wildlife is down there and what vegetation is down there. So it's a real crucial work they are doing, and it's very, very interactive with the guests. Like when they're sending that RV down, like you can actually see the screen and see what is down on the sea floor, and you will be surprised at how vibrant it is down there. But yeah, not just IACO, all of our guides are trained to certain standards. We are part of 1% for the planet. So this is 1% of our total revenue will go to 1% for the planet, and they're an umbrella charity. So they spread that money out across various charities like marine conservation, climate change charities. So there's a lot of good that we are trying to do at Secret Atlas. But I can see there has been some questions come in, so we will answer some of them now. And we've got some photography specific questions. So Giancarlo, I am gonna come to you and put you on the spot for these. But someone's asking, do some people actually rent longer lenses for the trips instead of buying them?
Yeah, I mean, that is a good option. I mean, if you don't have a long lens, buying one could be a big investment. There is one downside to that, which is if you've never used a piece of equipment before, you don't really want one of these trips to be the first time you use it, because you want to be really comfortable with your gear. Otherwise, you're going to risk missing shots. That being said, that is definitely an option, and there is actually a rental place in Svalbard but you need to contact them a lot in advance if you want to find the equipment. But yeah, that's definitely an option. Many people do that. Yeah. The second part of the question, which is, you mentioned not bringing filters. Do you like to ever use a polarizing filter in the Arctic? Definitely a polarizing filter is a good choice. I personally focus more on wildlife, so I don't worry too much about that, but that is definitely a good thing to bring. I just try to deliver a message, which is don't bring too much stuff, because if you bring too much stuff, you're just going to be fiddling around and not really enjoy the moment, you know. What kind of photography do you like the very best? Landscape, wildlife? I really like wildlife, and even if I do have a landscape photo, I would say 90% of the time I shoot everything with a 200 to 600 millimeter focal length range. Yeah.
So in the last two webinars, we did speak about the new restrictions coming into place for Svalbard. I will touch on that again. So from the 1st of January 2025, there are new restrictions coming into place. This is affecting the distance to the wildlife, but it's also affecting landing sites. But being a smaller ship, just 12 passengers, we are not as heavily affected, so we can still access some of those restricted areas for the bigger ships. But as I say, because we've got a smaller ship, like, we are allowed to land at more places. But for the wildlife, there is restrictions coming into place. It's going to affect the bird cliffs, it's going to affect the walrus and the polar bear. The polar bear is probably the biggest one, so dependent on the time of year, it could be up to 500 meters restriction. And if you ask me, does this make a difference to our trips? Absolutely not. I think even seeing a polar bear, if you're seeing a polar bear at 500 meters, if you're seeing it at a kilometer out, it's still a humbling experience. And the best thing about Svalbard is we're seeing the polar bear in its natural environment. We're seeing the polar bear in its home. We're watching it hunt. We're watching it go about its life. So yeah, I really don't feel it's going to limitate us. And often on our trips, we do sometimes head up to the pack ice if the conditions allow. And yeah, if polar bears is sort of on the bucket list, that's the one you want to see up close. Like, we can absolutely, if the conditions allow, we'll head up there and the rules don't apply. But of course, we will keep a respectable and a safe distance from the bear at all times. Back to some photography questions. So Giancarlo, I'll hand over to you about how many batteries are sensible.
I think that, again, like, assuming that you guys are bringing 2 camera bodies, I would say 2 batteries per body would be enough, because normally our excursions, our outings, they are half a day most of the time, which means that, you know, we're always going to go back to the ship at some point, and then you can charge your batteries if needed. So we're usually not out for the whole day. So 2 batteries per body, it's enough. Yeah, definitely good. I only use my iPhone, don't have special cameras. Is that okay? Well, it's clearly a little bit different. So you with an iPhone, well, I think iPhone 15 does have a zoom lens. iPhones are pretty good these days. So I actually just got, I don't have an iPhone, but I have a Google Pixel, which also has this zoom lens, and I'm really impressed. So maybe you won't be able to take photos that you can print, 2 meters wide, but I've seen iPhone photos that really, really surprised me. So I think it's definitely good. Yeah.
I'm just going to touch on that as well, especially for Northern Lights photography.
Yeah.
The colors that your phone camera can pick up are really, really incredible. So yeah, don't feel like you have to have the top of the range big lens cameras to come on these trips. They are for all levels of photography.
One more about photography. Does the camera need to be mirrorless so as to be truly silent? Not necessarily. I don't think so. Zodiac is definitely noisier than a camera. So, wildlife can be very sensitive, for example, to human voice. So to people yelling or, moving their hands, like moving suddenly, but the click of the camera is unlikely to disturb a bear. That being said, if you have the option, going silent with a mirrorless, I do that. But yeah, it's never been a problem, really. What is the maximum aperture of a long lens that would be useful? Is f11 too dark at 800 millimeters? That really depends on the season, because, for example, in Svalbard, from mid-April all the way to August, you have 24 hours of light, which means that most of the time there's going to be plenty of light to shoot. Sure, it might be overcast, but normally it's never particularly dark. So I think that lens is, I think I know which lens you're talking about. I think it's a Canon. I think that's good. Yeah, my 600 millimeters is 6.3 600, and I've never had problems with it being too dark. And some people use long lenses with a teleconverter, which means they lose a couple of steps of light, and that's usually fine. In Greenland, clearly, if we are getting close to sunset, then it might be a little bit dark. But yeah, that's a specific situation.
Do you have to overexpose or underexpose in the Arctic?
I mean, it's not a general rule. It really depends on the conditions, as in if we're talking about early season, so you still have a huge coverage of snow and ice, and it's really bright, then clearly you might have to play with the exposure. But in summer, like in June, for example, where the tundra is, comes out of the snow, the snow melts. So it's same as everywhere else, really. And it really depends on the subject, because let's say you have a white bear on a dark tundra, that's one scenario. But if you have a dark, like a blue fox on a white landscape, then that's the opposite, clearly. So it's really like scenario specific. I can't really give like one answer that applies to the whole situation. And then there's a second part to the question. What situations do you have to open up the lens, and what kind of landscape do you use the underexposure tactics? Is it really hard to photograph the northern lights? Again, like these are all specific, like especially the one about the landscape, it's a very specific question. And this is the type of things that we work with you guys on when we are on the field. So we're out there, and maybe even before going out, depending on the light conditions, we already give you a couple of suggestions about, what settings to use, what lens to use. So these are like, very specific questions that we can address in the field. And about northern lights, no, it is not that hard, especially if you have a photo guide like Virgil, who is a specialist in northern lights and is running some of the northern lights trips in Greenland. But yeah, no, it's not particularly complicated. Once you understand the basics, which is something we will talk about on board before we go out and shoot the northern lights, it's not that complicated. Is aperture something to consider? At 200 to 600 millimeters, f6.3 versus 400 millimeters f2.8, for example. Yeah, I think I already touched on this a little. I use that specific 200 to 600 millimeters, and it's perfectly fine. And personally, I would always choose reach over aperture in this kind of scenarios, because if you have what we call a pixel bear and it's perfectly exposed, it's not as nice as having a bear that it's a little bit closer but maybe a little bit dark, which is something that we can deal with in post-production. So I always recommend choosing a longer lens in this scenario, especially because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of light in Svalbard. So yeah, that's not a problem.
I just really want to extend my thanks again, Giancarlo. Thank you so much for joining us today. But if anyone does have any further questions, wants to continue the conversation, do drop us an email, sales@secretatlas.com. And this is our office team. So both Anna and Margarita, they're both photographers themselves. They're really experienced in the field as well with photography. Do drop us a message, and we'll be happy to get back to you with any of your questions. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you on board. And yeah, if anyone's interested in trips that Giancarlo is on, again, drop us an email. He's a leader on quite a few of our photo tours for 2025, and I'm sure he will be for 2026. Thank you everyone for joining. We will see you soon.
Thank you, guys.